I'm really privileged to introduce you, our keynote speaker, Dr. Beverly Mullings. I'm going to a little bit more. One of the collaborators and steering committee members of the Black Experiences with Planning in Canada Research Project. Dr. Mullings is a professor of political economy in the Department of Geography and Planning at the University of Toronto. Her research interests explore themes such as racial capitalism, urban governance, Black feminisms, and Caribbean radical traditions. In her keynote this morning, she'll explore the role of Black communities refusing global racial capitalism through resistance and struggle, looking back to ancestral stories, exploring current challenges, as well as the spaces and relations that can support this work. Outside of the classroom, I've gotten to know and experience Beverly in her learning style, particularly through the Caribbean Solidarity Learning Study Circles, which is a space and community to learn about Caribbean scholars and thinkers and what that means for our work and activism in the city in Toronto. So I invite you to journey with her, with Dr. Mullings, to draw connections about the work we're involved in the city, across the country, and globally. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Beverly Mullings.
It's indeed a real privilege to be here at TMU, situated on the ancestral lands of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, Haudenosaunee, and Wendat peoples. And yes, this land is covered by Treaty 13. It's protected by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement to peaceably share and care for the land and all our relations. Thank you. Human and more than human. And it is with deep respect that I acknowledge the historic and continued care of the land, the air, and waters by Indigenous peoples of this place, Dagarondo, where we are gathered, and our collective responsibility as implicit treaty holders to do the same. And as we gather to learn about Black experiences of planning, I'd like to acknowledge that not all our people came to these lands as migrants and settlers. Specifically, I wish to acknowledge our ancestors who were brought against their will and made to work on these lands. I believe that advancing Indigenous sovereignty and Black liberation, those are two goals that are deeply and inextricably linked to one another, and we remain committed to advancing both in our mutual freedom struggles. I'd also just like to thank, before I begin, the Black Experiences with Planning project. It's been such a delight for the last couple of years to listen and to learn with awe as the various people who've done interviews and spoken to people have come back with results. I'd also like to thank Abigail and Magdalena and Hannah for bringing me here. And I hope that what I have to say will just generate some interesting conversation. I come to this talk not as a planner, so I give you the warning, but as a scholar of political economy. So, what does it mean for Black planning to be viewed as a worlding practice? And what radical possibilities for living otherwise does it offer? And this is a question that I pose for us to sit and ponder with for the next couple of minutes. To answer this question, I believe we need to first examine what is Black in Black planning, and how an understanding of the historical discourses and practices that created Blackness as a racial category can help us to understand its power as a concept and as a methodology for bringing into being a different kind of future. The genealogy of the idea of Blackness is one that has been explored and debated by many scholars in Black studies, and it's not my intention to explore all of the debates around this term. But I do want to capture how racialized people made Black of the world, to use Achille Mbembe's term, have refused the colonial, racial, imperial logics at the heart of Western understandings of humanity, our relationship to each other, and to our other than human kin. As numerous scholars have written, the idea of Blackness emerged as a racial category within early modern Europe, alongside the rise of capitalism and colonialism. And as Cedric Robinson reminds us, while capitalism did not create race, it intensified and globalized existing forms of hierarchical social differentiation, many of which emerged through colonial conquest. Blackness emerged as a racial category as capitalism became a dominant system of value creation in the world. As a racial category, Blackness continues to authorize how labor extraction, dispossession, and violence are organized. Hortense Spillers demonstrates this dynamic in her classic article, Mama's Baby, Papa's Maybe, where she explains how slavery rewrote Black bodies, how Black bodies were described, understood, and controlled, creating a grammar in the United States that fixed Black women to tropes, the mammy, the matriarch, the Jezebel, and cast Black men as absent or pathological. These representations then became cultural truths rather than historical products. As Sylvia Wynter and others have argued, Blackness was never a neutral descriptor, but a necessary conceptual invention that helped define what counted as fully human, that is, man. The concept of Blackness, in effect, became the negative ground against which Western humanity defined itself. For Wynter, what has been taken as the human in modern thought isn't a universal condition, but a particular Western bourgeois conception of the world embedded in Western liberal values and ideals. Wynter implores us to reject this view of the world when she asks us to view being human not as a static identity, but as a continuous, collective, reconfigurable practice. She asks us to recognize that what it means to be human is narratively produced, and that our current narration of how we should be in the world is one that can be reinvented. But the thinking through of Blackness should not be confined to documenting how Europeans imagined and created hierarchies of humans to serve colonial, capitalist, and imperial ends. For as Denis Ferrer da Silva argues, to think through Blackness is not only to gain insight into the violence that raciality has historically authorized and made morally lawful in the world, or how people categorized as Black make life under dehumanizing conditions. Thinking through Blackness can teach us how to disrupt existing colonial, racial, capitalist logics and build new futures. In short, thinking through Blackness can help us to change the architecture of our global presence. For Da Silva, thinking through Blackness should be understood as a methodology, a way to understand how racial subjugation functions as an expression of authority fundamental to modern existence, and also as a way to dismantle subjugation, either through ethical demands for a different kind of existence. This, to my mind, is the Black in Black planning. It's an attentiveness to the place of Blackness in the grammar of modern reason and the ways that racialized people, those made Black of the world, challenge its most deeply held truths. Like abolitionism, Black world-making has a commitment to rethinking the world order as we know it. For me, the Black in Black planning is thus, yes, a methodology, a set of guiding principles that structure how we make sense of diverse experiences of Blackness and ways of being that disrupt colonial, racial, and imperial logics. Catherine McKittrick, in her book, Dear Science, argues that Black methodologies already exist. They are already present in the everyday anti-colonial placemaking practices deployed by people subject to the violence of extraction, expulsion, and death. She asks that we read and notice the conditions through which self-replicating knowledge systems are breached and liberation is made possible. As she reminds us, rebellion is method making. So I believe that Black planning is a form of Black worlding. It is the strategic, tactical, operational, contingent practices adopted by racialized communities to bring into existence the future they would like to see. While professional planning concerns itself with finding new ways to foster sustainable, equitable, and resilient urban futures, Black planning does more than this because it is committed to exposing and disrupting the logics of domination, extraction, and obliteration at the heart of the colonial racial capitalism. In short, all forms of Black planning are driven by ethico-political obligations to refuse how Blackness shapes relations in the world. If Black world making refers to the ongoing efforts of communities made Black of the world to bring about futures made impossible in the present, then refusal is its most powerful tool. As Tina Campt explains, refusal is an orientation towards the world that involves a rejection of the status quo as livable and the creation of possibility in the face of negation. That is a refusal to recognize a system that renders you fundamentally illegible and unintelligible. It's the decision to reject the terms of diminished subjecthood with which one is presented, using negation as a generative and creative source of disorderly power to embrace the possibility of living otherwise. Refusal, then, entails a turning away from the terms of legibility, visibility, and inclusion defined by state, capital, and settler power. It's a gesture of withdrawal, but also a movement towards other modes of economic life, towards autonomy, opacity, and forms of collective endurance and relationality that exceed the logics of extraction and governance. In this sense, refusal is better understood not as a reactive politics, but as a generative one. Saidiya Hartman's notion of wayward lives and Tina Camp's idea of quiet refusal each illustrate how Black women in particular have practiced refusal through mundane acts of care, kinship, migration, and ungovernability. Leanne Betesomasake Simpson, drawing on Anishinaabe traditions, defines refusal as a form of love and resurgence, anchored in Indigenous legal orders and ways of relating that rejected settler recognition as the price of autonomy. I argue if we take the time to notice how refusal structures Black world making, we can gain important insights into the radical possibilities that Black planning offers as a generative, active, and everyday practice of living otherwise. Through 3 vignettes that I view as examples of Black world making, I'm going to try to illustrate the different ways that racialized communities made Black of the world have utilized refusal to redirect energies towards different futures based on ancestral modes of governance, care, and relationality. And I aim to make the case for these world-making practices to be understood also as forms of Black planning that offer radical possibilities for living otherwise, even in the face of extreme violence and death. So the first, I want to speak about solidarity, collaboration, and the creation of new land relations as a kind of form of refusal. And I want to do so by sharing with you a historical moment within the history of the Caribbean. So up until 1838, throughout the British Caribbean, most racialized workers were dispossessed of their capacity to sell their own labor, and I know you know this. Their labor was owned, it was commodified, and consumed by others through the legal institution of chattel slavery and state-sanctioned violence. Enslaved people in Jamaica, where I do most of my research, could neither own land nor property. And because of the legal peculiarity of chattel, which is a legal construct, they were dispossessed of ownership in themselves and their children, who were born the property of those that enslaved them too. In such environments of unfreedom, it's difficult to envisage how cultures of reciprocity, sharing, or trust could have emerged. Africans transported to the region rarely shared the same ethnicity, let alone language, and over time had experiences that were vastly different from the Creole-born population raised on the island. But a strong sense of community did emerge from the plantation experience, one that emerged from the spaces where people could congregate outside of the watchful eye of plantation owners and overseers. This was the place of the plot, the only place in the plantation industrial complex where enslaved people could reclaim their personhood. The plot, sometimes also called the provision ground or Creole garden, depending if you speak in French or English, was land set aside on the plantation for enslaved people to grow the food that they ate. While slave owners devised provision grounds in order to save money, these spaces unknowingly provided enslaved peoples with access to time and space that was both within the order dictated by the plantation, yet detached from it. As Sylvia Wynter argues, while the official plantation ideology would develop as an idea of property and the individual's rights to property, that is, as the right to own the property of Black labor power, the provision ground ideology would remain based on man's relationship with the earth, the base of his social being. And I must say this quotation comes from Sylvia Wynter's 1975 writings, her unpublished manuscript, Black Metamorphosis. So excuse the gendered use of man to represent the human, which she has corrected much later on in the 1990s and 2000s. So Wynter thus establishes the plot as a rejection of the idea of property ownership as defined by Enlightenment thinkers. It was a space that allowed enslaved people to establish land relations that were closer to the communal land practices that existed in West Africa. Cultures of cooperation, reciprocity, and reciprocity that emerged from the provision ground provided the foundation for the social economies created after emancipation and the formal end of slavery in 1838, but not indentureship, only slavery. Emancipation represented a new set of challenges for people who had been formerly chattel, as the ties that they once had to the provision grounds were now broken, and the colonial government, in a desperate attempt to protect large-scale plantation agriculture, sought to discourage small-scale peasant farming through discriminatory laws that made it very costly to acquire land. Rich planters also made access to land near impossible through predatory rental practices like tenancy at will, where someone could, there was no contract, you could be let go from the place that you were living on at will, or charging per capita rents for each able-bodied person resident in a household. But many Black people had their own visions of the relationships that they wanted to establish with the land. Almost all wanted to become independent cultivators and to maintain the collective practices of mutuality and market exchange that had become a part of the ideology of the provision ground. Partnerships between local Black congregations, deacons and ministers, and a variety of white evangelical missionaries circumvented this obstacle through the creation of free villages. These were tracts of land that were purchased by Baptist and Quaker intermediaries and divided into parcels and subsequently sold to newly freed farmers, or as they were called, settlers, ironically, who often pooled their financial resources in order to purchase these subdivided small freeholds. In 1841, approximately 150 to 200 free villages had been established on approximately 100,000 acres of land. And this facilitated the construction of approximately 3,000 villages or cottages. By 1845, approximately a third of the formerly enslaved population in Jamaica had relocated to these new settlements. And I have a picture here of Clarksonville, which is still, well, there are many of the free villages that still exist in Jamaica and are understood to be, and this is just one of them that I have a picture of. In Haiti, where the population had freed themselves earlier in 1804, the formerly enslaved and their descendants turned to ancestral African communal labor traditions like dopkwe to survive the almost total economic blockade of the country by other slaveholding and imperial powers in the region, led largely by the United States. Known as Conbit in Haiti, La Woz and La Maguite in St. Lucia, Convoy in Guadeloupe, Gayap in Trinidad, and Morning Sport and Day for Day in Jamaica, these collaborative labor traditions required farmers from the same area to collectively work on each other's land, often for several days, with the knowledge that their neighbors would reciprocate later. Women were really important leaders in these early forms of Black planning, which I think they are. In Haiti, they often coordinated the labor needed to sustain the cooperative, multi-generational land management system that emerged after the revolution, known as LACU. And across the region, they still continue to be the primary organizers of the cooperative savings groups, popularly known as Partner, Susu, some of you will know these and may be part of them, Boxhand, that finance much commerce and trade in the region. What remains distinctive about these early forms of Black planning is the extent to which they reflected the provision ground traditions that committed members to the tacit rules of care, responsibility, and accountability, rooted in centuries of survival under plantation regimes. I believe that it is in the sustained denial of the basic means of sustaining Black life that gave shape to these many of these complex informal economies throughout the region. I contend that these historic Black planning practices emerged from the refusal of Black communities to be governed by rules that not only legitimated and rationalized the natural right of European settlers to appropriate indigenous lands, but also that subsequently determined formerly enslaved people unfit to develop new land relations. Instead, Black communities rejected the Enlightenment belief that owning property was an expression of individual will, opting instead for collective modes of caring for and sharing land, drawing on ancestral labor practices and methods of farming, animal relations, and ecological knowledge acquisition. So I really wanted to talk a little bit about when we think about solidarity, the long histories and connections to places other than even the regions of the Caribbean that Black people drew together in order to make life happen under systems of great duress. I now want to talk about endurance as a form of refusal, endurance through memory and story. Another Black worldling practice that has refused the death-dealing logics of settler colonial racial imperial capitalism can be seen in the ways that racialized communities made Black of the world utilize memory work and stories to endure exceptional forms of violence. Creative and spiritual practices are important forms of refusal, and both can be considered part of a broader practice of care. What memory work and story refuse is the belief that these practices have no transformative capabilities beyond themselves because they're not monetarily quantifiable. I want to offer the forms of life work currently taking place in Gaza, Palestine, as an example of Black planning. And I offer this example because it reminds us that Blackness operates as a structuring logic that is not exclusive to people of African ancestry, and that increasing numbers of people are being governed today as if they were Black people of the past, with all that entails: wanton violence, disenfranchisement, and exposure to all kinds of risks and premature death. The catastrophic destruction of infrastructure in Gaza since October 2024 and ongoing restrictions by the State of Israel on the movement of humanitarian aid and equipment to rebuild makes the business of making daily life a struggle against premature death. Recent estimates by the Max Planck Institute for Democratic Research and the Center for Demographic Studies put the number of conflict-related deaths at Gaza at more than 100,000 by October 6, 2025. This level of mortality was so high that life expectancy fell by 47% in 2024. With 92% of houses destroyed, 85% of water, electricity, sewage networks, and road infrastructure extensively damaged, with over 25 million tons of rubble that could take 40 years to remove, and one estimate says you could go around the earth 700 times, and that's about the amount of time and space you'd need to remove the rubble. Communities struggle to carry out even the most basic life functions. Gaza is an unlivable space where the daily risk of injury, disease, and death is ever present. The unfolding of the war and the siege of Gaza demonstrates a level of violence and dehumanization that many human rights organizations have attributed to anti-Palestinian racism and have condemned. As Heba Bahajan, a displaced mother in the Al-Masawi neighborhood, states, we are deprived of the most basic necessities of life. What we are living is not a human life. We are living in constant suffering. In an interview with Ezra Abu Kamar, Heba offers some insights into the daily challenge of social reproduction that Gazans face when she explains, charging a mobile phone has become a daily struggle. If I need to charge my phone, I have to send my young son to someone who has solar panels. He waits there for 2 hours just to get a small charge. If the weather is cloudy, if there's no sun, I spend the whole day without using my phone. And this affects my children and their education, which now depends entirely on the internet and mobile phones. Amidst such devastation and loss, cooperatives have emerged as a vital source of community solidarity and mutual aid. Many cooperatives are run by women and youth and focus on food and traditional crafts. These solidarity economies do more than help women generate incomes to support families. They sow the seeds of endurance, which is the theme I want to think about, endurance as refusal, enabling communities to refuse the deathly objectives of blockades and aid restrictions. NGOs like ANERA support women's co-ops to bake traditional sweets like mahmoul cookies, produce cheeses and honey, as well as medicinal herbs. Food co-ops like the Food Bank Center in Gaza play an important role in redressing the high levels of child malnutrition, and in so doing have been instrumental to strengthening food security in Gaza. Craft co-ops are also a critical source of economic support for Palestinian women and children in refugee camps and villages across the Gaza Strip. Cooperatives like Benzaria, Beta, and Al Noem in the occupied West Bank not only provide income and employment opportunities for women, they are also a vital space for solidarity, care, and preservation of ancestral knowledge. Take, for example, the Kalandia Camp Women's Handicraft Co-op, located near the main checkpoint between Ramallah and Jerusalem. Focused on handicraft production and humanitarian aid, this co-op runs a sewing factory, it runs a knitting factory and embroidery workshops, and extends mutual care to affected families. This co-op's been in operation since 1958, and it has taught generations of women the art of tatrees, a traditional embroidery practice considered a visual language that tells the story of the land, Palestinian identity, and collective memory. Traditionally hand-stitched onto clothing, the cultural practice of tatrees is seen by many, including UNESCO, as an important intangible cultural heritage. The activities, I think, of co-ops like Calandria can be understood as a form of Black planning, because not only are they creating opportunities for women to economically support communities, they also make it possible for participants to refuse the psychological harms that attempt to erase and destroy Palestinian culture and histories and a Palestinian sense of place. I believe it's important to pay attention to the knowledges that these initiatives enable, because it is precisely in the concepts of mutuality and of solidarity across borders that the grammar of refusal can be discerned. This is a grammar that continues to assert the relationship of Palestinians to the land in intergenerational art practices like tatrees, even as the land continues to be destroyed and appropriated. And for me, like the early labor sharing practices that emerged in the Caribbean, Palestinian cooperatives offer a vision of another kind of world where the spiritual and the creative have transformative energies, and where memory work through stories become tools for refusing the racializing discourses that seek to silence, erase, and dehumanize Palestinians and their narratives in the public sphere. Thinking about Palestinian efforts to remain and to make life on the land through the lens of Blackness helps us to see how memory work and stories can be powerful negations of the colonial and imperial belief that acts of exceptional violence can permanently subdue populations into submission. Learning from Palestine, I think, will be a valuable lesson for communities in Cuba, currently experiencing the violence of economic and energy blockades by the United States in its bid for regime change. The third vignette that I want to share really talks to the power of grounding, that term that comes from the work of, well, the term that comes from Rastafarianism and Rastafarian practice, but also in the work, reflected in the work of Walter Rodney, Learning and Planning. So my third example of the radical possibilities of Black worlding can be seen in the heroic efforts of communities to refuse the exceptional violence of the recent surge in immigration and customs enforcement, ICE, in the state of Minnesota, USA. I've chosen to focus on events in Minnesota to explain how thinking through Blackness as a methodology can help us to see how disciplined learning can sow the seeds of negation, which Tina Camp believes can be a regenerative and creative source of disorderly power to embrace the possibility of living otherwise. In the aftermath of the 2020 protests against anti-Black police violence that erupted after the murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis, Minnesota, communities across the country took to the streets, calling for radical reforms to end police brutality and ultimately to dismantle systemic anti-Black racism in multiple spheres of life. The Black Lives Matter movement emerged during this time as an important space for imagining, for planning, and building a different kind of existence. Guided by principles committed to radical care, justice, peace, and liberation, BLM movements around the country and the BLM Foundation sought to intervene in policy processes ranging from affordable housing to community safety. These organizations also partnered with community leaders across the United States to center abolition principles and build radical organizing models rooted in Black power, self-determination, and support for families. Scaling up to form a coalition of over 50 groups representing the interests of Black communities across the United States and globally, including South Africa and Brazil, the movement for Black lives continuously refines its vision for safeguarding Black life through advocacy, legal challenges, mutual aid, and direct action. This is very reminiscent of Walter Rodney's praxis of grounding, the painstaking work of cultivating critical literacies in the pursuit of transformation. The public education, organizing, and policy interventions of the Black Lives Matter movements and the movement for Black lives, I would argue that they are a very critical infrastructure for racialized communities under siege all over the world. The disciplined practice of learning, visioning, and planning across community organizations in process since 2020 helped communities to quickly mobilize in 2026 against a surge of over 2,000 federal agents across that city, ordered to carry out the Trump administration's escalation of immigration and customs enforcement operations. In scenes of terror, reminiscence of historical slave catching and lynching campaigns, racialized communities have been subject to extraordinary forms of violence and subjugation as officers hunt down suspected undocumented people. The Brookings Institute reports that in over 50 cases, ICE allegedly smashed car windows to justify arrests in their search for undocumented migrants. With over 540,000 people deported, and just think about that number. 32 dead while in custody, countless families torn apart, and recently in Minnesota, 2 protesting citizens shot and killed on the street. City streets in many of America's most populous racialized communities have become dehumanizing spaces of state violence. It is within this context that the planning, the organizing, the educational programs developed in the years that followed the death of George Floyd have come to bear fruit. It is not wholly surprising that communities in Minnesota have been so forceful and successfully so, and steadfast in their opposition to the forms of state violence that accompanied the surge of ICE agents in their city. Within communities, members have organized neighborhood watch groups to protect and look out for one another, alerting members to the location of ICE agents and being on hand to video record the actions of agents. Community members have also engaged in mutual aid, helping neighbors in hiding with food, rent, laundry, and other necessities, driving the children of vulnerable parents to school, and getting in touch with family members if someone is snatched and detained, and often with no information as to where they have gone. As organizers learn from organizers in other cities strategies and tactics to defend their immigrant neighbors, they are also learning the importance of building relationships and communicating in ways that minimize the risk of infiltration by authorities. Much like the strategies historically taken by Black communities to avoid detection and to keep members safe, marronage, fugitivity, flight. Communities like Minnesota that find themselves under occupation are learning how to refuse an emerging colonial, racial, capitalist, imperial order that aims to erase, to dispel, to expel, and dispossess migrants. These moments remind us that community-led Black planning is most effective when grounded in disciplined learning with those made Black of the world. So we're at a crucial moment as the global capitalist rules-based order, largely defended and upheld by Euro-America, has begun to crumble. At a recent World Economic Forum, our own Prime Minister Mark Carney admitted as much in a speech where he warned of an unfolding rupture in the world the end of a pleasant fiction and the beginning of a harsh reality where geopolitics is submitted to no limits and no constraints. Now, while Carney didn't elaborate on what the pleasant fiction was, and I am sure that for the people of Gaza, Sudan, Venezuela, Cuba, Haiti, and for that matter, much of the world's surplus populations, there was never a fiction, let alone a pleasant one. He explained that the system of global racial capitalism persisted because everyone participated in rituals that they privately knew to be false. And many people have celebrated this speech, but I don't think they've actually listened to what he was actually saying. When Carney states, "We knew the story of the international rules-based order was partially false, that the strongest would exempt themselves when convenient, that trade rules were enforced asymmetrically, that international law applied with varying vigor, depending on the identity of the accused or the victim, this fiction was useful. And American hegemony in particular helped provide public goods, open sea lanes, a stable financial system, collective security, and supports for frameworks for resolving disputes." And he just needed to add to that for countries in the global north. And when he says that, he neglects then to explicitly acknowledge that it was the very rules-based order that made the systematic predation against and plunder of racialized communities made Black of the world possible. While Carney's admission was aimed at rallying middle powers to unite to the rules governing the operations of global racial capitalism, he nonetheless captured a sliver of truth about the changing geopolitical landscape, that brute force and plunder have become the guiding principles of imperial control, not only in those places considered Black of the world, but also in places like Canada and Europe that once considered themselves allies and partners in rule. The recent Munich Security Report states that the world has entered an era of wrecking ball politics that is destroying the Euro-American alliance. And while the agreements that once protected the interests of middling imperial states are now being turned against them by the United States in its predatory bid to become a planetary empire, there is very little said about the escalation of brute force as a mode of accumulation that is now exercised without regard for any of the rules that once defined the global order. As we have seen, there are no global restraints to the use of lethal force, such as bombs and drones, by imperial powers against less powerful governments, their leaders, and civilians, who for the most part are rendered as collateral damage. These are grave threats to the efforts of racialized communities made Black of the world to build a different kind of future, one that nurtures and allows life to flourish. Thinking more specifically, what does this emerging era, mean for the planning efforts of racialized communities made Black of the world in Canada? It is not unfathomable that the same forces that have outlawed policies related to EDI, gutted public sector jobs that once provide large numbers of Black professionals pathways for accessing education, housing, healthcare, it's not unfathomable that it could not take place here in Canada. The efforts of the President of the United States to use state authority to censor and remove paintings and exhibits that address the histories of slavery, lynching, or state brutality, or to label these realities as divisive or political, speak to a shifting landscape of recognition of the value of Black life. As Terence Sullivan observed in a recent article written for Amnesty International, and it's a long quote, but I will read it, "This is not a cultural debate. It's not a disagreement over policy as much as it is a disagreement over humanity. The willful disregard and erasure of the Black experience is the state asserting control over memory, dictating which histories are acceptable and which are too threatening for their narrative to be public. Under the Trump administration, federal power has been used to redefine racism out of existence. Executive orders, agency guidance, and political appointments have pushed the idea that systemic racism is a myth, and the ills of chattel slavery and its legacy are exaggerated, and that any effort to name inequality in itself is itself discriminatory. By erasing Black history, the Trump administration seeks to distract his supporters from the real causes of the economic inequality and insecurities that has accompanied the rising wealth gap, which in 2026 was the widest it had been for 30 years. We need only to see the growth of anti-immigrant and white supremacist discourses here in Canada to know that we shouldn't entirely dismiss the possibility of US-style state violence against racialized communities unfolding in this country. Black people in Canada have always actively imagined, strategized, collaborated to bring into being the futures they want to see. Visible in the earliest histories of the Black presence in Canada are the radical refusals that I have argued to be instrumental to Black worlding practices. Whether in the form of the decision of 540 Black loyalist families to migrate to Sierra Leone in 1792, or the formation of the first Black Union, the Order of Sleeping Car Porters in 1917, or through the community building efforts of places like the Negro Community Center in Montreal and the Negro Citizenship Association in Toronto, the worlding practices of Black communities have always used collaboration, memory, and the arts, and grounded learning as tools to make place in Canada. The work of the BEPIC project is an important part of the process of recording and remembering how Black communities in Canada have used these tools of refusal to transform municipal planning practices. As the day unfolds, we'll learn more about the ways that organizations like the African Nova Scotian Road to Economic Prosperity, the Blackhurst Cultural Centre, and the Maison d'Haïti have envisaged and built new Black worlds, and the challenges that they have faced in doing so. While the denial of necessities to sustain Black life are not as blatant today as they were in the earlier periods of Canadian history, imaginaries of Blackness still shape how resources are recognized, how resources are shared, how relations with land are created, and whose histories are recorded, recognized, and protected. Working at the interface of municipalities and communities, organizations that advocate for Black communities and Black planners play a valuable role. They have the technical skills and the institutional capacities to help communities to negotiate policy landscapes and to understand and articulate their needs and rights for themselves. Black planners and advocacy organizations in Canada fight numerous daily battles, some of which you will hear as the day progresses, with municipalities to affirm and protect Black life. But as we usher in a period of greater anti-immigrant sentiment and hostility towards Black life, what sort of challenges will Black planning and Black planners face? To what extent might the gains achieved through careful place-based forms of advocacy and negotiations with municipality and planners be sidelined by cost considerations and budget cuts as the reality of Trump's tariffs work their way through municipal policies? It would seem that now, more than ever, we will need to hold the Canadian state to its promises to address anti-Black racism and systemic discrimination in the criminal justice system, in the health sector, as well as employment and social development, as laid out in that wonderful document, the Black Justice Strategy. But if we are to hold on to the radical possibilities of Black worlding demands, by which I mean a world free from the limits of coloniality, racism, capitalism, imperialism, the limits that it places on planetary flourishing, Black planning interventions will increasingly need to forge deeper connections with wider networks of communities across places and scales. And this means learning and politically organizing with as much of the planet's surplus populations caught in the crosshairs of emerging forms of ethno-national imperial violence that is breathing new life into 17th century dehumanizing discourses of Blackness and their associations with absence, decay, and inferiority. Now, more than ever, we need the tools of refusal, solidarity, endurance, and deep learning, and I think that might be the most important one, that have always defined Black planning to be that generative and creative source of disorderly power that enables us all to embrace the possibility of living otherwise. Thank you.